Prof. Mundir as a raised senior lecturer of Arabic and Linguistics and director of Arabic program at the Cornell University. Hello, Prof. Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you for joining our webinar. We truly appreciate your time.
You are very welcome, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Well, audience, before we begin our webinar, let me announce the housekeeping rules via Zoom. Number one, kindly mute your microphones unless invited to speak. Second, use the chat feature for questions during the Q&A sessions. And the last, this webinar will be recorded for documentation purpose. Dear audiences, L-Branstock are a community of Quranic and interpretation studies scholars who are committed, in addition to improving, advancing, and expanding the Quran and Tafsir studies, also to accommodate activities of the Quran and Tafsir studies in the context of democratizing ideas and knowledge in the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia. Under the theme Qurani First Unlocking Horizon, initiated by the L-Branstock platform in collaboration with PKUMI, Kaderisation Ulama Program of Mosque of Istiqlal, Jakarta, PT IKI University, and various institutions and organizations. This is an international initiative aimed at broadening the scope of the Quranic studies through interactive discussion with global speakers and preparation classes led by mentors. The program explores key terms from relevant reading material, enabling participants to deepen their understanding and actively engage the diverse dimension of Quranic scholarship. The webinar brings together academias, researchers, scholars, and practitioners to discuss a Quranic studies under the title Reading the Quran on the Basis of the Rasm. So, audiences, let's open our agenda today by reciting Basmalah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
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 Well, audiences, we step to the next agenda. It is my great honor to invite Professor Dr. Muhammad Darwis Huda, MSI, as the director of the postgraduate program of PT IKI University to deliver the keynote speaker. For Professor Dr. Muhammad Darwis Huda, MSI, time and place are yours.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Excellency Professor Montrions, Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Welcome to this webinar.
Thank you.
Would like to speak Indonesia. Karena ini teman-teman banyak bahasa Indonesia, saya ingin berbicara dalam bahasa Indonesia sebentar saja. Saya seharian kebetulan belum istirahat ini lagi menguji interview teman-teman calon pegawai negeri sipil. Ini ada 3 hari sampai hari Senin. Yang menarik adalah adanya jabatan fungsional baru yang saya kira belum pernah ada sebelumnya, yang tahun ini diangkat menjadi PNS, namanya pengembang tafsir Al-Quran. Pengembang tafsir Al-Quran. Yang diharapkan nanti pengembang tafsir Al-Quran ini akan sampai pada tingkat kecamatan sebagaimana penyuluh agama. Jadi teman-teman dari kajian Al-Quran ini ada prospek baru untuk menjadi pegawai negeri sipil di bidang pengembang Al-Quran, tafsir Al-Quran. Tidak disebut kajian karena kalau kajian dia akan masuk di BRIN, Nah, untuk apa? Sesungguhnya adalah agar Quran itu menjadi motor penggerak dalam dinamika kehidupan manusia. Jadi bukan hanya Al-Quran itu sebagai pembenar terhadap persoalan-persoalan yang dihadapi oleh umat manusia, tetapi diharapkan dia menjadi penggerak. Nah, teman-teman tentu tahu bahwa penafsiran Al-Quran ini memang harus terus dilakukan. Ya, tidak hanya terbatas pada penafsiran-penafsiran yang ada. Kalau kita lihat itu ada biasanya digolongkan menjadi 3 alternatif. Ada memang penafsiran yang bersifat dengan pendekatan tradisional, yang ini lebih pada pemahaman teks dan biasanya hanya terkait kepada masalah-masalah hukum, terkait dengan leksikon. Jadi makna kata-kata saja yang kemudian diolah sedemikian rupa dan selalu terkait dengan persoalan-persoalan hukum. Lalu kita kenal juga pendekatan kontekstual. Ini lebih fokus pada pemahaman Al-Quran dalam konteks historis dan sosial. Lalu ada hermeneutik, yang ini juga penekanan pada pemahaman Al-Quran sebagai teks yang bermakna dan dinamis. Jadi saya pikir penafsiran-penafsiran baru itu memang diperlukan karena transformasi masyarakat kita tentu berjalan terus, sehingga terjemah atau tafsir yang ada mesti kita juga kembangkan. Saya sering mengambil satu kaidah usul yang menarik ya, al-ma'ani al-muhtamalah muradah. Ya. Makna-makna yang terkandung dalam satu ayat, satu kata, itu dikehendaki. Jadi kita tidak usah terlalu khawatir menyalahi tafsiran-tafsiran terdahulu tanpa harus menyalahkan tafsiran-tafsiran terdahulu. Bahwa tafsir-tafsir terdahulu itu pada zamannya oke. Nah, tapi boleh jadi penafsiran-penafsiran itu pada hari ini dan di masa yang akan datang perlu dikembangkan. Ada banyak perubahan-perubahan dalam masyarakat, bukan hanya di bidang penafsiran, tetapi cara mengimplementasikan, cara mengejawantahkan penafsiran-penafsiran itu terhadap masyarakat juga mesti diperbaharui. Mungkin ada hal-hal contoh yang sebagai ilustrasi ya. Di zaman saya yang memang generasi baby boomers itu, orang tua kita kalau melarang sesuatu itu biasanya menggunakan shortcut saja. Nah, contoh begini, jangan duduki bantal, nanti kamu bisulan. Kita menerima itu, tidak membantah, tapi coba lakukan hal itu seperti itu bagi anak-anak milenial atau Gen Z itu, Gen Z yang sekarang ini generasi alfa, itu pasti tidak akan masuk itu. Dia akan mengambil bantal, lalu didulku di depan kita dan dia mengatakan itu tidak bisulan tuh, tidak bisulan tuh. Nah, ini tidak mungkin dilakukan pada hari ini untuk anak-anak yang sudah mengalami transformasi sedemikian rupa. Jadi kalau yang seperti itu adalah kalau menurut Kerlinger itu semacam tenacity yang kita terima memang secara turun-temurun, tetapi untuk saat ini itu di zaman saya itu suatu kebenaran yang kita terima dan tidak ada persoalan. Tapi untuk sekarang mesti sudah pendekatannya juga tidak bisa seperti itu. Nah, oleh karena itu menurut saya tidak perlu kita terlalu khawatir dengan hadis yang mengatakan man fassaral Qur'ana bi ra'yihi falyatabawa maq'adahu minan nar. Jadi saya memahami hadis ini bahwa orang yang menafsirkan Al-Qur'an Kalau saya mengartikannya itu begini, orang yang menafsirkan Al-Quran seenak perutnya, nah, orang yang menafsirkan Al-Quran seenak perutnya, maka itu yang menyediakan tempatnya di neraka. Tetapi selama kita menafsirkan Al-Quran itu dengan tujuan bahwa Al-Quran itu adalah lil hidayah, untuk hidayah, no problem. Nggak ada masalah. Nggak usah khawatir. Asal tujuannya memang dimaksudkan sebagai hidayah, Al-Quran itu sebagai hidayah. Nah, tapi memang tidak boleh kemudian menafsirkan tadi seenak perutnya itu dengan tujuan melecehkan Al-Quran, mendegradasi Al-Quran, sehingga tidak menjadi hidayah dalam kehidupan umat manusia. Nah, itu yang tidak dibolehkan. Jadi kalau ada kata, akar kata satu ayat misalnya, yang ternyata bisa ditafsirkan dengan penafsiran-penafsiran yang berbeda dengan yang kita dapatkan sebelumnya, tidak usah khawatir selama tujuannya untuk hidayah tadi itu. Saya beri ilustrasi misalnya begini. Di dalam Al-Quran ada kisah Yusuf yang ayatnya itu mengatakan falamma qadaina alaihil maut ma dallahum ala mautihi illa dabbatul ard ta'kulu min sa'atah. Ayat ini selama ini semua tafsir-tafsir itu hanya bercerita pada sebuah kondisi di mana Nabi Sulaiman itu sudah lama mati, ya sudah lama wafat, tapi tidak ada yang mengetahui tentang kematiannya itu kecuali setelah tongkatnya dimakan oleh rayap. Kita memastikan bahwa Sulaiman waktu itu menggunakan tongkat kayu. Lalu tongkat kayu itu dimakan rayap, kemudian tertelungkup karena jatuh dari topangan tongkatnya itu. Itu begitu saja terjemahan itu. Tapi kalau misalnya kita perlebar itu, tafsir itu bahwa hati-hati bagi para penguasa, karena seringkali orang-orang dalam itu, orang-orang sekitar, pembisik-pembisik di sekitar kekuasaan itu yang menggerogoti kekuasaan dari dalam. Jadi tidak diartikan secara harfiah bahwa Nabi Sulaiman itu wafat dengan berarti sudah lama wafatnya, itu tidak ada yang mengetahui kecuali setelah dimakan rayap. Itu semacam metafor saja dan dimaknai sebagai seringkali terjadi, ya, atau Nabi Sulaiman itu sebetulnya kekuasaannya sudah lama itu tidak eksis, disebabkan oleh orang-orang dalam yang mengambil alih kekuasaan itu secara diam-diam, bekerja seperti rakyat. Nah, saya tidak mengatakan bahwa penafsiran ini adalah sesuatu yang mutlak ya, karena semua tafsir itu sungguhnya adalah bersifat nisbi, dia relatif. Sehingga tidak ada persoalan, kita tidak usah khawatir bahwa tafsiran-tafsiran yang kita berikan terhadap ayat Quran itu, selama tujuannya untuk lil hidayah, maka menurut saya tidak ada masalah. Nah, menyangkut sedikit tentang rasam, memang rasam itu sesungguhnya kan baru dibakukan di zaman Utsman. Kalau sebelum-sebelumnya kan berbagai model tulisan begitu itu. Dan kita pahami bahwa Al-Quran itu sebetulnya yang akustiknya itu. Jadi bacaannya karena Jibril menyampaikan bukan dalam bentuk kitabatan. Yang disampaikan itu adalah bacaan. Nah, sehingga bacaan itulah yang menjadi standar bahwa Al-Quran itu adalah yang akustiknya itu. Nah, oleh karena itu ketika ulama mengatakan bahwa sebuah qiraat baru disebut sebagai sahihah kalau memenuhi 3 syarat, mesti ada riwayatnya, mesti kemudian bisa dibaca dengan tulisan atau rasam Utsmani, kemudian sesuai dengan kaidah nahwu, ini pun juga masih bisa diperdebatkan. Teman-teman semua, sekedar saya menggantikan Pak Rektor yang tidak bisa hadir pada kesempatan ini, dan tentu saja Anda tidak akan mendengarkan saya, tetapi akan mendengarkan pembicara. Oleh karena itu, saya sudahi saja. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for Professor Dr. Muhammad Davisude, MSI, for the speech. Dear audiences, without further ado, we have to come to the core agenda of our meeting, which is to hear the speech from our lecturers today, Professor Mundir Yones. The webinar will be moderated by Nur Azka Inayatus Soharo, MA, as a triple IU alumnus and a visiting student at the University of Edinburgh in 2022. The time and place are yours.
Okay, thank you very much for Mas Roshad for a briefly introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, dear audiences, Professor Yunis and Dr. Abdul Mu'id Nawawi and the Dean of the Director of the PT IKI, Prof. Darwis Hude. Good evening all, and I believe you are all eager to know about our webinar. This is a very anticipated event. And first of all, I will greet Professor Munzir Yunis first. Hello, Prof, and good morning. I
Good
believe it is
morning.
still
Oh.
early morning in the US now.
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock, 8 a.m.
Yeah,
8:20.
yeah, I appreciate that because it is like a difficult time to adjust with Indonesian time, I believe.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, we are very excited to hear about your presentation about reading the Quran based on Rasm. Yeah, dear friends and all audiences, I will briefly introduce Professor Munzir Yunis. He is a raised senior lecturer of Arabic language and linguistics at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University in New York. And he obtained his PhD from the Department of Linguistics, the University of Texas at Austin in 1982. And his research mainly focused on Arabic linguistics, teaching Arabic as a foreign language, the language of the Quran, and comparative Semitic linguistics. He has authored numerous books, some of which The Routledge Introduction to Quranic Arabic, The Integrated Approach to Arabic Instruction, and Charging Steeds or Maidens Performing Good Deeds in Search of the Original Quran, which perhaps this is main discussion in today's webinar. Okay, before we start, I will inform to the audiences first in bahasa Indonesia, pardon. Teman-teman audiens sekalian, mohon berpartisipasi dengan kondusif karena ini merupakan forum ilmiah yang sifatnya akademis, sehingga mohon komentarnya dijaga, atau barangkali kalau mau berkomentar di chat itu dengan bahasa yang sopan dan supaya menjaga kondusivitas seperti itu. Okay, without any further ado, I think we are all eager to hear more about what is Rasm-based Quranic reading and how to read the Quran based on Rasm. And please, Prof, time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's very nice of you, and I'm very happy to be here. My approach since I was a child, I wanted to understand the Quran. So generally, if you ask an Arabic native speaker about the meaning of a verse, so many verses of the Quran, they will say Allahu A'lam, or somebody else knows about it, or sometimes at Cornell here, at Cornell University, I have students who are of a Muslim non-Arab background, people from Indonesia, from Pakistan, from Nigeria, from all over the place. And they think that Arabs actually understand the Quran better than they do. But very often, the Arabs themselves, native speakers, and very highly educated native speakers will tell you, I don't really understand this. And there are so many examples of that. One of the examples that I like to give is the topic of today's discussion, which is chapter 100 in the Quran, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا. So when you ask people, what does وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا mean? And then you go through the chapter, and people generally have sort of a vague understanding of maybe horses going to battle. And then if you start thinking and trying to understand the different verses, you get lost. There isn't really a coherent theme, and then people's excuse is always, we don't really understand. God knows. This is old Arabic. This is so. I started teaching this course at Cornell University for students of a Muslim background from different places. And I started with Juzu Amma, the short surahs, because they are familiar to many students. They use them in their prayers and they've heard them many times. But I found out that I really don't understand them myself, although I'm an Arabic linguist. I've studied Arabic linguistics. I know Arabic very well. And so I was forced to sort of dig deeper and go into the tafsirs, the traditional tafsirs. And the traditional tafsirs were not actually very helpful. They confuse you, and you go through a tafsir like the standard tafsir is that of Tabari. And so after reading page after page after page of sometimes conflicting interpretations, they will say, Wallahu a'lam. We don't really know. Only God knows. So I started digging deeper and deeper, and I realized that you really cannot understand the Quran through the interpretations, through the standard interpretations. You can get an idea, you can get a vague understanding, but in order to understand it, you really have to go deeper than that. And I realized that you really have to go to the Rasm itself and reread the text before the interference of the grammarians and the mufassirin. And that's what I did with chapter 100, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا. If you know Arabic well, you can see that وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا as a verse, as a two-word combination, is actually not very well formed in terms of the grammar and the meanings of the words. So going back to the pre-dotting stage, I said, why don't we try a different dotting scheme? So I thought of the phrase وَالْغَادِيَاتِ صُبْحًا, which is a perfectly formed phrase, which means women or maidens going out in the morning, which is a very well-formed phrase. And then from that, I wanted to read more of the text of the Quran. I went to other verses, to other chapters, verses, and I started reading more about it. I came across a book by a German scholar named Gunther Luhling, who said that, whose claim in the book, that you really need to go before the dotting of the Quran, before the introduction of the harakat, the fatha, dhamma, kasra, sukun, and so on, before the introduction of the alif inside a word, which was often inserted, and this is documented in Muslim history that during the Umayyad period, for example, there were some alifs introduced in words like qalu and kanu, which were read without an alif. And then the hamza. The hamza was also introduced later, and we know historically that the Hamza was not part of the Rasm. If you look at the Rasm, the original Rasm, it lacks these 4 elements: the alif inside the word, the harakat, the dotting, and the Hamza. So when you go back to this form of the Quran and start reading it, particularly with the help of Syriac and Hebrew, which had direct influence on the language of the Quran, or they were related because the Quran.
Napa, carilah lagi yang.
I'm sorry, there's.
You can continue your presentation, please. I'm sorry. Yeah. Pardon, Prof, your microphone is muted.
I got it. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm back now. You really have to go back and read the Quran through the Rasm, and then with the help of Syriac and Hebrew. These are languages that are structurally very close to the language of the Quran. So if you look at a word like habara, or the word, for example, Rahman, Rahim, words like this, they are really found in those languages with sometimes a slightly different meaning. Like Rahman, Rahim has the meaning of loving and beloved. From Raham. Raham in Syriac means loving. So Rahman is someone who loves, and Rahim is someone who is beloved. So when you start looking at that, you really get a better understanding of the Quran. As an example of the, I'll give, if the time allows, I'll give examples from all these 4 areas: the Hamza, the Alif, the Harakat, and the dotting. The dotting is basically the theme of today's presentation, which is Al-Adiyat al-Dabha as opposed to Al-Ghadiyat al-Subha. But an example from the Alif, the way the Alif was introduced and the kind of influence it had, and the way most probably it was read and was intended at the beginning. There is a German scholar by the name of Gerd Puin who analyzed Surat Al-Kafirun. Al-Kafirun. قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين. Now, it's understood by Muslims that I don't worship what you worship. You don't worship what I worship. لا أعبد ما تعبدون. So Gerd Puin said that the alif in لا أعبد ما تعبدون actually was not there. And the phrase was لا أعبد ما تعبدون, which is found in a word like لا أقسم. Like when you say لا أقسم بهذا البلد in chapter 90 Al-Balad, it's not لا أقسم, it's لا أقسم, which is emphasis, emphasizing meaning, not negating the meaning. So قل يا أيها الكافرون, you unbelievers, people who do not believe in me, لا أعبد ما تعبدون, I truly worship what you worship. Like it's a call to monotheists, for example, Christians, Jews. I worship what you worship. I definitely worship what you worship. You definitely worship what I worship. لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم لكم دينكم ولي دين. You have your way, I have my way, but we're all trying to reach God. It's like that. It's instead of being sort of exclusionist against others, it's really, like we're all together. We're all creations. We're all created by the same God. And we try to reach to that God in our own ways. We worship the same God that you worship. And just finally, I will say this, and then I will let, if you have questions you would like to ask. The last thing that Garrett Puin himself says, and which I would like to repeat, is that if we reread the Quran this way from the Rasm, we would gain a better understanding of it in general. It would be a more tolerant text. Very often, instead of excluding, you are kafirs and we are mu'minun, like that, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, it's like we're all created by the same God, and we all aim for the same thing. We want to reach God, but in our own ways. It's like diversity, but accepted, not exclusionist kind of ideology. And there are examples from Hamza that I have in the book, the way Hamza was introduced, and with different, introducing different meanings that probably were not intended in the original copy of the Quran. Just the last thing I would like to say here is that when we reread the Quran this way, again, we find it like a gentler, more accommodating, more accepting of the others. And I don't want to be harsh on the interpreters and say that, you know, they moved the Quran in a way that was more confrontational, aggressive, or anything like that. It is possible that there was, maybe sometimes they didn't understand something, they didn't have the knowledge of Syriac or Hebrew or other languages that it's the languages, their language, those languages had an influence in the language of the Quran, or understanding them would help us understand the Quran better. And some instances make you feel as if they had an agenda. That, for example, the agenda that I sometimes speculate about is that probably there was something against women, sort of excluding women. The book I wrote, which is وَالْغَادِيَاتِ الصُّبْحَ instead of وَالْعَادِيَاتِ الضَّبْحَ, it's like instead of accepting women as part of the worshiping group, the people who really are part of this community, sort of marginalizing them. And there are examples of from chapter 79, which is وَالنَّازِعَاتِ غَرْقًا, which I believe was also about women, and it's البازغات عرفا, those women who want to distinguish themselves in good deeds. So the idea would be, now again, this is speculation, and it needs, some of you can do some research on that and prove or disprove this theory that there was an effort to marginalize women or remove them from the public space, and marginalization of women, marginalization of the role of women in the public space. With that, I will come to the conclusion of this short presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have that I may be able to answer.
Thank you very much, Prof. That is such an intriguing introduction to our topic today. And I believe our dear friends have numerous questions about what you has brought forth about this topic, because this is very intriguing. In our opinion, Rasm is only pertaining to riwayah and how we read the Quran based on such a steady knowledge, and that you explore more about how we could read the Quran based on the Rasm in its early form. It is really intriguing, and perhaps a groundbreaking research for us in Indonesia. So I will let our friends to offer a question, 3 questions perhaps for this term. So please, whoever of you who has any question, you can ask directly to Professor Yunis, or you can chat on the chat box and I can read. Okay, please. While we are waiting for the questions, perhaps I have a lot of questions and I will ask you directly. Perhaps this is very intriguing that you mentioned about how early scholars tend to marginalize women in the Quran by interfere in their rasm, in the rasm of the Quran, by adding or omitting some dots from the rasm. Could you please explore more about how could you argue about that conclusion?
So if you look at chapter 100, which is Al-Adiyati Dabha. So we have وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا فَالْمُورِيَاتِ قَدْحًا فَالْمُغِيرَاتِ صُبْحًا فَأَثَرْنَ بِهِ نَقْعًا فَوَسَطْنَ بِهِ جَمْعًا. Now, if you ask a native Arabic speaker, a scholar of the Quran in the Arab world who is, proficient in Arabic and so on, you ask them, what does this mean? They say, well, this is about horses going to battle. And then you say, where is the word for horses? And they say, well, adiyat. And you tell them, adiyat doesn't mean horses in Arabic. It means the things that run only, because the verb ada yadu in Arabic means to run. Wal adiyat. So where is the word for horses? And then they start explaining, well, the Mufassirin said this, and this is, and then they always throw at you this accusation almost. Who are you to come in the 21st century and tell us what this word means? And these people 1400 years ago knew what it means. But then you go to the dictionaries, you go to the usage of the language, you go to the language of the Quran itself. Al-adiyat is not used in the Quran in the sense of horses. There's a verb ada ya'du, which means to transgress sometimes. But there's nothing, so there's no linguistic support for the kind of interpretations they have of these words. And so, and we know, if you look at the original forms of the Quran, there were no dots. And we know that the dotting was introduced later, and that there were differences. If there's a classic book called Kitab As-Sab'a fil Qira'at by Ibn Mujahid, and who will say that, a word like fatabayyanu was also read fatathabbatu, which was fine. The word like na'lamu ta'lamu, a word like jabbar, I'll write some of them here in the chat. For example, there's a word Qatar, which is very strange to an Arabic speaker. Doesn't mean anything. And then you put a different scheme on it, a different dotting scheme. Jabbar is a very common word in the Quran. And then, so you start seeing the way that the language of the Quran works if you just redotted things. And so when you say وَالْغَادِيَاتِ صُبْحًا, it's when you know enough Arabic, you feel that al-ghadiyat subha is really a well-formed phrase. It's meaningful, it's correct grammatically, it doesn't have any of the defects that you would have in وَالْعَادِيَةِ الضَّبْحَةِ. Al-'adiyat dabha first, the words don't mean the same things. And also, dabha, if you know Arabic grammar well, if you know i'rab, I don't know how many of you are familiar with i'rab, dabha is not treated as like any of the regular categories of i'rab. It's an exceptional form. And the interpreters had to write so much explaining the i'rab, the case system of that word. Whereas when you say وَالْغَادِيَاتِ subha, it's perfectly fine in terms of i'rab, in terms of reading, in terms of meaning, and so on. So when you reread the way I've been rereading those phrases, they make perfect sense at so many levels, like semantically, syntactically, the i'rab, and so on. All of it is well formed and it makes sense. And then when you put them together, when you see that there are 5 chapters in the Quran that have this fa'ilat or muf'ilat or like al-mursalat, al-nazi'at, and so on. So the interpreters, the mufassirun, say, al-nazi'at could be, they would say could be, and not we don't know. They could be angels, or it could refer to death, it could refer to the stars, it could refer to this. But we know, if you know Arabic grammar, that alif ta at is the ending for a feminine plural. It's like you say al-mu'minat, we're talking about women. But they will say angels, horses, stars, and they deliberately avoid the reference to women. So you start thinking there must be something there that they're trying to avoid that. And you see it in all these al-mursalat, as-saffat, al-nazi'at, al-adiyat. All of them are like that. Al-dhariyat. Yeah, all of that. And if you just said, why don't we try women for a change? And then you see that the text actually makes sense. But with angels or stars, it's very contradictory. Yeah.
That's very interesting explanation. Thank you very much. And I find here, okay, before I continue with the question, may I have some time to explain in Bahasa Indonesia? Perhaps
Please,
our
go ahead.
dear audience need to do that. Ya, teman-teman semua audiens, intinya secara singkat, Profesor Munzir Yunis menjelaskan kepada kita bagaimana beberapa penafsiran surah-surah pendek, terutama yang di sini di-highlight adalah surah Al-Adiyat, itu tidak menemukan makna yang baik, yang bisa kita pahami secara jelas. Jadi ketika kita membaca penafsiran-penafsiran dari para mufasir, kita menemukan pada akhirnya para mufasir ini bilang wallahu a'lam bishawab atau wallahu a'lam bimuradi, yang mana hanya menyerahkan makna atau penafsiran Al-Quran ini kepada Allah. Oleh karena itu, Profesor Munzir ingin memahami Al-Quran secara lebih komprehensif dengan kembali kepada Rasm Al-Quran pada saat titik atau diakritik dan juga hamzah dan lain sebagainya itu belum ditambahkan ke dalam Al-Quran. Sehingga pendekatan beliau adalah melihat bagaimana Al-Quran ketika bentuknya itu belum ditambahkan atau belum seperti sekarang yang seperti kita baca pada umumnya. Selain itu, beliau juga melihat bagaimana hubungan-hubungan kata-kata dari Al-Quran secara sintaksis, kemudian secara semantik, dan beliau juga mengaitkan dengan bahasa-bahasa di luar bahasa Arab, seperti halnya Hibru dan juga Siriak Aramaik. Barangkali itu untuk inti dari presentasi beliau. And these are some questions on the chat box. First one, may I ask, considering that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, his companions, the Tabi'in, and subsequent generation not only in written form or Rasm, but also through oral transmission. Which one is traditionally given greater emphasis? Does the ijtihad undertaken by this professor, which is based on Rasm, also find support in oral tradition? I believe the audience here means that which one we should give or put on greater emphasis, on the Rasm or the oral tradition. And then is the written text or the Rasm also supported by the oral traditions? And in a nutshell, in essence, what is the primary source of this ijtihad? This is the first question. And the second one, I'm sure doubting the Rasm at that time made a serious different perspective and opinions among Muslim scholars. How do you say about this? I believe the question means, how do you come to the conclusion of your research as your presentation? And how is your argument opposed to the traditional arguments that perhaps we all know about?
So can we take it like one question at a time? The
Oh,
first
okay.
question is the oral tradition as opposed to the written.
Yes.
Yeah. My personal belief, I believe that actually the Quran can be understood better if we went back all the way to the Rasm and started over. I think when the interpreters were writing their interpretations, I believe they were influenced by the political circumstances around them, and there were certain social political considerations interfered, and that's why probably the theme of al-adiyat, like horses going to battle, as opposed to women worshiping, was introduced. Maybe the circumstances at the time that the Mufassirin were writing their tafsirs, that was happening. My belief, my personal, in my modest opinion, in my humble opinion, I believe that a better understanding can be gained by going back all the way to the Rasm and starting with that, with knowledge of the Rasm, and also it's important to understand what the other languages, especially Hebrew and Syriac, because the language of the Old Testament and the New Testament, that they influenced or were in contact with, or some people would say in conversation with, the language of the Quran. The Quran was, many of the terms would be shared by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so, you say like Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, for example, would be all the three religions would use that. And I mean, one thing that probably not many people think about, if you look at, I'm going to write this now in the chat box, like when you read, okay. When you say, for example, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the word Bism, when you know Arabic, you study Arabic, the word for name is actually bi'ism. I'll write it here. Okay, where is that? If I can find, okay. So the correct writing is actually bi'ism, right? But if you know Hebrew, if you study Hebrew, in Hebrew it is Bashem, the name. And Shem in Hebrew, when you say Shem, which means it was ism, it's like saying God. Hashem in Hebrew, the name is God. It's like that. And I think if we brought this understanding, this kind of relation with other religions and other languages that represented these religions, if we brought that in, we understand why things are written this way, why things are treated this way. So I think in short, or in conclusion, going back to the rasm is probably the best way to go to really reach a good understanding that's not influenced by political social considerations that the mufassirin and the grammarians were influenced by. That's my my own take on the issue. Now there was I'm sorry, what was the second question that you asked?
Yeah, the second question is about the dotting scheme in the time of the Rasm performed. It made a serious different perspective and opinion among Muslim scholars. Like we know there are some scholars, even they are called Ashaykhani fi ilmi Rasm. And how do you have opinion pertaining to this? And how do you relate to the reading of the Quran based on Rasm that you offer?
Actually, I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with this. Actually, the tradition of like different readings of the rasm. To me, the rasm, I go back to an old manuscript. I have some copies of old manuscripts without the dotting, just going back to the rasm, and that's the way I look at it. And I look at it as this is the material. It's almost like somebody going like find site and trying to understand it like in those terms. So I go back, and the qualifications I bring in are my knowledge of Arabic and my knowledge of linguistics, and I know some Hebrew and Syriac, and try to understand it through that. Yeah, I hope I've answered your question that way.
Iya.
Yeah.
Untuk teman-teman mungkin barangkali ada yang mau bertanya langsung dengan bahasa Arab. Profesor Munzir sangat ahli dalam bahasa Arab, jadi bisa ditanyakan secara langsung ya. Barangkali saya bertanya tidak terlalu memahami pertanyaan teman-teman yang ada di chat box. There's third question here. We know that the Quran was originally transmitted verbally, while the Rasm and Dhabt of the Quran came later. The question is, when it was transmitted verbally, were there also differences in the pronunciation of verses, such as, for example, between wal adiyati dhabha and wal ghadiyati subha as exemplified?
Okay. Now it's this is a big question, whether which came first, and this is something I deal with in the book. Which came first, the written version or the oral version? Some people, there's a scholar by the name of Fred Donner, and also you probably have heard of Luxembourg. These people claim that at least parts of the Quran, maybe not the whole Quran, but parts of it, were first read. They were first transmitted in writing. And there is a hadith. If you look, there's a book called Kitab al-Masahif. I don't know whether you are familiar with it. Some of you might be familiar with it, called Kitab al-Masahif. In Kitab al-Masahif, in the first few pages, they say that there's a hadith attributed to Zayd bin Thabit, and the hadith says, the Prophet said to Zayd, إنها تأتيني كتب لا أريد أن يعرفها كل أحد. هل تعلم السريانية؟ قلت لا. قال تعلمها فتعلمتها في 17 يوما. And in some versions it's like هل تعلم العبرية لغة اليهود, and so on. So this tells you that the Prophet was saying to Zayd bin Thabit, who is known to be the one who was in charge of collecting the Quran and putting it in, like as a mushaf, producing it as a mushaf, that writings come to me and I don't want everyone to know about these writings. Do you know Syriac? And Zayd said no, and he said, learn it. And he learned it in 17 days, which I think means, do you know how to read Syriac? Probably he understood. It was Syriac and Arabic are very closely related. If you know Syriac, you know Arabic, Syriac, it's very easy to transition from one to the other if you know the script. So I think this is some evidence that maybe certain parts of the Quran were, they came out written, they were introduced as written forms first. Another piece of evidence that shows that at least parts of the Quran were written is the word, an example like فَتَبَيَّنُوا and فَتَثَبَّتُوا. As I mentioned, Ibn Mujahid, Kitab As-Sab'a fil Qira'at. Ibn Mujahid says, as long as the skeleton, the rasm is the same, you can read the word differently. You can say na'lamu, some words are written na'lamu and ya'lamu, ta'lamu. So you have, like, I'll write them here, na'lam, ta'lam, ya'lam, but never, for example, na'lam and a'lam. The only differences were found in the dotting. And if you have the other example, فَتَبَيَّنُوا and فَتَثَبَّتُوا, you never find like فَتَبَيَّنُوا and فَتَفَكَّرُوا. Which means, to me, this means that somebody was reading the same rasm but understood it differently. Now, if it was orally transmitted, if it was, different ideas were being transmitted, you would find some differences in the script too, in the rasm. But the rasm is always the same, which means that it's just a matter of reading the same text, but applying a dotting scheme differently. So this, I think, this proof that the writing was first.
Okay, that's a clear answer, I hope, for the questioner. Okay, there's Rafa Marifa Anwari wants to ask a question, please. You can open your mic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time. My name is Rafa from PTIQ University. So before this, I found your written somewhere in the media or in your social media that the professor read when you read the Surah Yunus, not Yunus, Yusuf, and you make a comparison with the Bible and feel the Qissat Yunus, Qissat Yusuf, يعني قريبة أوي كده قريبة إلى البيئة إلى المنطقة اللي الدكتور عايش في فلسطين طبعا. ده اللي إحنا بنحس في إندونيسيا، أنا خصوصا لأننا يعني إحنا طبعا في إندونيسيا بنتعلم القرآن منذ صغار، عمرنا 5 مثلا بنتعلم القراءة والكتابة، ثم بعد كده يعني صاروا مثلا في الثانوي بنتعلم اللغة العربية، وطبعا هناك أسئلة مثل أسئلة اللي زي أولاد صغيرين بيسأل كده زي اللي الدكتور في المقدمات يقول يعني ما التفسير لهذا السورة وكده. وعندي نفس الأسئلة منذ صغر، يعني منذ ثانوي عندي سؤال. يعني لما أدركت اللغة هو يعني بفهم قليل طبعا، ولكن اللي أنا لاحظته يعني إحنا أندونيسيين مش بنلاقي المترادفات اللي يخص بنا، يعني ما بنعرفش يعني إيه نحس الضوء زي مثلا أصحابنا العربي اللي يحس من القرآن. ممكن عشان المترادفات والقصص والجو في القرآن نفسها يعني قريبة مع الثقافة. مثلا ما بنلاقيش طبعا المترادفات مثلا من فاكهة استوائي. طبعا هناك مترادفات اللي البيئة قريبة مع بيئة العرب، مثلا الزيتون، النخيل، الرمان، وكيف تعصر الزيتون ويكون الزيت منور كده، يعني موجودة طبعا في القرآن. ولما سألت الدكتور هنا يجاوب أن لا، طبعا في القرآن يحكي عن أندونيسيا برضو، بيحكي عن عن مثلا مثل الجنة تجري بهم من تحتهم الأنهار مثلا هكذا. هذا لا يوجد في الشرق الأوسط نفسها. ولما أنا زرت هناك زرت منطقة الشام، لا، هذا الإجابة غير الصحيحة، لأن الأنهار مش بس في أندونيسيا، يعني طبعا هناك يعني بلاد العرب مش كله صحراء طبعا، يعني لما نزور الشام طبعا أنهار أيضا والأشجار أيضا. هذا أنا عايزة رأيكم في هذا. والثاني طبعا لما بنلاقي ده أنا السؤال من أنا عشان عوام يعني ما بعرفش حاجة. يعني مثلا so many the Orientalists have debate about the repetition in the Quran. يعني تكرار أحيانا بحس إن لما أحفظ القرآن يعني التكرار ده بيلخبطني، يعني التكرار ده مثلا يعني يجي تكرار اللي شبه بعض ولكن مش شبه قوي كده. فعايزة رأيكم في هذا. هل هذا يعني إيه، هل التكرار ده يعني يتحط قبل الرسم نفسها، ولا في الأثر من التكوين بعد الرسم؟ شكرا.
Okay. شكرا جزيلا. So just to explain, there are two questions. One is about the whether the Quran was basically revealed in the environment of the Arab world or Bilad al-Sham in particular, because the names of the names of vegetation, trees, rivers, and so on, like the names of, you have olives and you have pomegranate and so on, which are common in the Middle East, and you don't find the names of these trees in tropical climates, for example, a place like let's say Indonesia. And also but then in Indonesia there are flowing rivers, anhar, تجري من تحتها الأنهار, and so on, which is not found in the Middle East, but actually there are rivers in the Middle East too. The second question is about repetition in the Quran and whether it's confusing or whether there's like whether it has a function. So I'll start with the first question, which is actually it's a loaded question. It's a dangerous question. It's not easy because people who say, I mean, Muslims in general would like to think that the Quran is salih likul zaman wa makan, right? It's good for all time and all place. So you don't want to relate it specifically to one place, right? You don't want to say it's suitable for the Arab, Middle East, Sham environment. But then you go into things like, zaytun and teen, and it's as if you are speaking about very specific areas, like geographically. Talking about Jerusalem or about Mecca or about Sinai or something like this. I don't really know. I mean, it's a big question. My personal view is that it was addressing the Arabs in this environment and giving examples from that environment. So it's natural to focus on zaytun and teen and nakhil and so on. They probably they didn't know about avocados and mangoes then, and that's why they were not mentioned. Which is not, it should not be a big deal because this is, it's a message. It cannot include everything, and it's, you understand it the way that's possible for people. It's, it's spiritual. It's a holy book. The second thing is about the language, the repetition of the language of the Quran. The repetition actually is, I would say, it is one of the strong points of the Quran. It's actually the Quranic language is very beautiful, and that's something that I feel that many Muslims and many Arabs actually miss. Very often they just they don't appreciate the kind of beauty that the Quran brings in. And a lot of it, this beauty comes in through sometimes repetition, sometimes like the poetic structure, the rhyme. Let's say, for example, if you take as an example, let me just cite one here. Like in Surah Al-Ghashiyah, when you have أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ وإلى السماء كيف رفعت وإلى الجبال كيف نصبت وإلى الأرض كيف سطحت. All of this sort of repetition and rhyming. It's and then with a very clear message, and the message is always like, look around you and look at the miracles around you. Can you look at the rain, the way the rain works? Look at the clouds, the way they are formed. Look at this, look at that, and wonder about it. And then there must be a creator behind all of this. And there is the miracle. So that the language itself, through repetition, sometimes through rhyming, it's like an important literary device that they use. Yeah, so like the more Arabic you know, the more you appreciate this kind of literary device. It's really very, very nice and sort of drives the point in. That's, God wants you to understand it this way. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's someone who raised his hand. Please, for Colby Hazel.
طيب صوتي مديح يا الأستاذ. اسمي قلبي وأنا طالب في المغرب موروكو. عندنا في المغرب هنا المغاربة يسمونه ويقولون أنه المصحف المغربي المحمدي. وهذا
نعم.
المصحف متغير. الرسم المستعمل في هذا المصحف بغير ما استعمل في المصحف الذي انتشر في العالم، وهذا طبعا يؤثر في بعض الكلمات والجمل والألفاظ في هذا المصحف. وسؤالي، هل للمستشرقين أو للباحث في الرسم القرآني فهل عندهم آراء وأقوال الخاصة بهذا المصحف المحمدي المغربي؟ لأن الرسم المستعمل في هذا المصحف بغير ما استعمل في المصاحف المنتشرة في العالم. وهذا سؤالي، شكرا.
شكرا. أنا بصراحة يعني لست خبيرا في هذا المجال، ولكن من خلال دراستي للقرآن وتاريخ القرآن يبدو أنه كان هناك can I speak in English? Is that okay? So other people understand?
Okay. No
Okay,
problem.
yeah, okay. So the question was about the Maghribi, the Western Quran, which was actually used until the Quran was standardized in 1924 in Cairo, in Al-Azhar, when one form was adopted and became the standard one. But before that, there were two versions which were acceptable. So the way I understand it is that there were several Qur'ans at the beginning. There was like there were multiple Qur'ans, and when Ibn Mujahid came in the 10th century, he standardized 7. So there were more than 7, and there are like the kitab, for example, they say 10 readings, and sometimes they say 14 readings, and so on. So there were like 14 versions of the Quran, 14 different versions. And as the Muslim state gained more control, and so there was like a unification of the state political system, and also an imposition of one version. And we know that historically, the versions that were not acceptable to the authorities during Ibn Mujahid's time, there's a story of someone named Ibn Shannabud, you might have heard of him, who was actually whipped and jailed and tortured because he resisted accepting the standard. So there was always an attempt. There were several versions that people were using, and in time they wanted to standardize, one state, one rule, one government, one Quran. It's like this. There was a movement. So there was this, and it seems that two versions survived until the 20th century, one in Morocco in the western part of the Arab world, or the Muslim world, and one in the other parts. But then that was eliminated at the beginning of the 20th century by standardizing the Cairo edition of the Al-Azhar edition 1924.
Okay, thank you very much. There are plenty questions here on the chat box. I will read one by one, perhaps, Prof. Given the historical evolution of Quranic writing, with diacritics and vowel markings being later additions, how does the preservation of the original Rasm influence our understanding of the Quran's linguistic and semantic integrity across different periods?
I don't see the question here. So the question is, how is our understanding of the Rasm? How does that affect?
Yeah, how the attempt to preserve the original Rasm from the initial formation at the earlier stage until nowadays can influence our understanding of the Quranic linguistic and semantic integrity across different periods.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say if you really want to understand the Quran, you have to go back to the Rasm, and you have to put aside the interpretations that the Mufassirin came up with, because I believe that they were influenced by political, social considerations, and to gain a good understanding, the real understanding of the original meaning, you go back to the Rasm before the interpreters and the grammarians came in. I have examples of the way, for example, the grammar. Okay, let me actually elaborate a little on this. And it's a little complicated in terms of the grammar, the syntax of the sentence. But there is a verse in the Quran. It's in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 5. It goes like this. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. Now, I will stop here. Now, a native Arabic speaker, without the use of the diacritics, without the use of the fatha, dhamma, and kasra, would read this as follows. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين, which means, O you who believed, when you get up to pray for prayer, wash your faces and your hands to the elbow, your arm to the elbow, and wipe your heads, وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم, and your feet. So the idea is you wash your face and the hands, and if you think about it in practical terms, you wash the face and the hands. So it is important, the hand, but then the head and the feet are a little further out. You just wipe these. Now imagine if there is an environment where there's a scarcity of water. You don't have a lot of water. You don't have enough water. So you wash your hands, you wash your face. The rest of it, you just wipe it with a little water. Now the verse goes on to say, وإن كنتم جنبا فاطهروا وإن كنتم مرضى أو على سفر أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا فامسحوا بوجوهكم وأيديكم. Now, the gist of this is, if you are in a situation where there's no water, then the hand and the face, which you wash in the first place, now because you don't have enough water, you can just wipe them with sand to clean them. The places that you wiped, the places that you washed first, now you wipe, because there's a scarcity of water. And then it goes on to say, ما يريد الله ليجعل عليكم من حرج. God doesn't want to bother you, doesn't want you to suffer. ولكن يريد ليطهركم. But he wants to purify you, he wants to clean, he wants you to be clean. ليطهركم وليتم نعمته عليكم لعلكم تشكرون. So the idea here is to make, if you have water, wash your hands, your face, and then wipe your head and your feet. If you don't have water, only wipe your hands, wipe them. Don't wash them. You don't need to wash them. You just wipe them and your face. And we're forgetting about the head and the feet now because there isn't enough water. Yeah? And God wants to make life easy for you. God doesn't want to make life difficult, right? Now, look at what the interpreters did, what the grammarians did. They manipulated the grammar. So now if you go to a standard interpretation of the Quran, a standard translation, you will find this, in my view, sort of twisted kind of interpretation. They say, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم. So the way you understand, you have to understand it now, according to these interpreters, is like this. You believers, when you get up to pray, wash your hands and wash your face and wipe your feet, wipe your head, and wash your feet. So they like they go back and wash. So the Quran is very clear. Wash this and this, and wipe this and this. But they said, no, you wash this and this, wipe this and wash this and that. It's like making it so complicated through the use of the fatha, because now it's the object of the verb, and the object goes back and is joined to wujuhakum. They make, so if you go to the interpretations, hundreds of pages they write to complicate things, whereas the verse is saying God wants to make things easy for you. God wants to make your life easier, doesn't want to complicate things. But the interpreters complicated things. And why they did that? You can speculate.
Thank you very much. This is very thought-provoking idea for us to goes back to the initial form of the Quran. Okay, there's also another question here, Prof. Arthur Jeffries' controversial project aimed to produce a critical edition of the Quran by focusing on textual variants. In light of this, are you interested in initiating a similar project that focuses on the Quran through the lens of Rasm or consonantal script reading? How might such a project navigate theological sensitivities while contributing to academic scholarship?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very critical. I think probably the best way to understand the Quran is to go back to the Rasm and have a team of people who actually know Arabic grammar very well, know history very well, know Syriac and Hebrew very well, and are well trained in linguistics. And we just don't want the political interference that happened after that because of the environment that surrounded the Muslim community at the time. So you want to go back to the Rasm, and it would be great to have a team of people, a team of experts. You have to have very deep knowledge. You don't have to be a native speaker of Arabic, but you have to have a good, deep understanding of Arabic grammar, the Arabic language, and then there are, of course, references available. You can look at the interpretations, like Tabari and other interpreters. You find many of the answers you find in them. Like this, I'll just write an example. I wrote this example before. There is the word khattar. Now let's see the word khattar. The word khattar is found in Luqman, Surah Luqman, verse 32. Luqman. It says, وَإِذَا غَشِيَهُمْ مَوْجٌ كَالظِّلِّ دَعَوُا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ فَلَمَّا نَجَّاهُمْ إِلَى الْبَرِّ فَمِنْهُمْ مُقْتَصِدٌ وَمَا يَجْحَدُ بِآيَاتِنَا إِلَّا كُلُّ خَتَّارٍ كَفُورٍ. خَتَّارٍ كَفُورٍ. Now, a native Arabic speaker who knows Arabic well, we haven't seen the word khattar. And then by accident, I was reading a reference by someone named Al-Askari. And Al-Askari says, some people read this word as Jabbar. Jabbar. And Jabbar is found 10 times in the Quran in other contexts, whereas Khattar is not found anywhere else in the Quran except here. So if you really dig deep, if you look at the references, you have a good knowledge of Arabic, you have a good knowledge of Syriac and Hebrew, I think you can have and then based on the Rasm, I think the Rasm is perfect. There's no, there was no tampering of it. You can depend on it. And we have manuscripts that go back, and I have copies of them here on my laptop, that go back to around the year 675 or 700, only less than 50 years after Uthman, the Uthmanic Rasm, very, very early. And they don't have any, like there are no dots, no diacritics, no Hamza, no Alif, just the way they were in the original. And so if we look at these, if we take these as our point of, as our starting point, and with like good sound linguistic knowledge, and we approach it as, you don't have to approach it as a believer or as a, let's say, as a Muslim. You approach it as a scholar. You want to approach it as a scholar. Whatever the consequence, whatever the results are, you want to approach it whether you agree or disagree. And there has to be a team of people, arguing and discussing things, and maybe Muslims, non-Muslims. It's like it's a research project, not a belief-based project. Belief, there's no problem with it, of course, but you have to leave that aside and approach it as a text and understand it. And I think we can understand it better, understand the message better.
Perhaps if you want to commence that project, you can invite us, or perhaps from the audiences, who want to pursue further academic endeavor in Cornell University, you can pursue Professor Munzir to do such projects, especially that will.
Well, you need. Myself, I'm about to retire now, so we need young people. We need people who really have the energy and are willing to, invest and invest time and but I'll be happy to help in any way I can. It's a worthwhile project. It's very important. Yeah.
Oh, I want to retire soon, Prof.
Yeah.
Oh.
I am 72 now, so I'm reaching a retirement age. Any other questions, please?
Yeah. There's question in Arabic here. Ma ra'yukum lil hadith unzila al-Qur'an ala sab'ati ahruf wa alaqatihi bil mushaf alladhi kutiba ala rasmil Uthmani.
Now, the question is, what do we think of the hadith unzila al-Qur'an ala sab'ati ahruf? Now, the word sab'a, seven, is some kind of a magical word in Arabic, and not only in Arabic, but in other like cultural context. Sab'a, everything is sab'a. You wash 7 times, things happen 7 times, so on. So when they say unzil al-Quran ala sab'at ahruf, no one knows what that means exactly. Some people say, they're like the Quran was revealed in 7 different dialects. And then you ask people, what are the 7 different dialects? They will say, well, Quraysh, Tamim, and then they get stuck on the 3rd one or the 4th one. They don't really continue. We don't really know what the 7 are. Some people will invent things. We don't really know what it means. Unzil Quran ala sab'at ahruf. I don't think there is as far as I know, I do not think that there is a satisfactory explanation of what this verse means. Some people relate this to the Kitab as-Sab'a fil Qira'at of Ibn Mujahid, and people say no, there is no relation. So depending on where you are, again, it's something that you could probably write a PhD dissertation about. So what does it mean? How did it start? How does it relate to the Quran? But as far as I know, linguistically, it doesn't make sense to say that the Quran was written in Unzil Quran. I don't know exactly what it means. I don't think anyone knows what it means. If anyone in the audience knows what it means, I'd like to know. I would be curious to know.
Yeah. Please, from all the audiences, if you have any capabilities about the sab'atu ahruf in the Quran, you can raise voice about that. While we are waiting for that, we have another question here. If we want to re-examine a Quranic verse with respect to the Rasm, how to determine which form of the Rasm is correct among the many possibilities? How to determine which is correct? La nafi a'budu ma ta'budun, like previously you said in your presentation, or la taukid a'budu ma ta'budun.
Okay, so the idea is this, let's say, la a'budu as opposed to la a'budu.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I mentioned at the beginning that this was the idea by Gerd Puwen, this German scholar. And he gives as an example words like la uqsimu, which very often Muslims read as la uqsimu bihadha al-balad wa anta hillun bihadha al-balad. But it doesn't actually mean la uqsimu. It's not no, I do not swear. It's not like that. It's definitely la uqsimu. It's emphasis. It's I truly. Definitely there's no negation here. And in his paper, Gerd Puwen gives other examples of where you have la is used for emphasis. Again, it's one of those things that conceivably one can come up with an opposite view, but the evidence that he provides, I think, is clear. And we also know historically that during Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi's time, during the early Umayyad period, they say, you're talking probably about maybe 680 or 700 AD, like 70 years after the death of the Prophet, that, and this is documented, Muslim sources say this, that Al-Hajjaj introduced 2,000 alifs in the Quran. 2,000 alif. The alif was not part of the Quran. And they give the example of qalu and kanu. And it's quite possible, considering the syntax, the grammar of la a'budu as opposed to la a'budu, la uqsimu. La uqsimu is a clear case of emphatic la, not negative la. And when you think of al-kafirun, if you take the whole surah, okay, first, I mean, we know the verse from another context, la ikraha fi din, right? La ikraha fi din. Now, if you go to this, قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا نعبد ما عبدتم لكم دينكم ولي دين. It's like this. Freedom. You have your way, I have my way. I'm not judging you. You're not wrong. It's not like this. It's not, it's not like you're bad, I am good. It's la. So the last verse, lakum dinukum waliya din, I mean, some people will say, well, it actually means you're this way, I have nothing to do with you, which is sort of the aggressive kind of interpretation. But it can be taken as a tolerant way of saying, you have your way, I have my way, and we're all good. You worship, I worship. It's like an inclusive kind of understanding of the chapter. Yeah.
Okay. There's also a response pertaining to how you go back to the initial form of the Rasm without the critics. This is a response here. I think when the verse is returned to its original form without being bound to any particular interpretation, it will change all the implication of Sharia and social laws. This is because each interpretation has its own legal implications. If they are returned to the Rasm, it will change all the association created from the Uthmanic Rasm. To what extent can this theory be developed? Isn't it true that the Quran has already been conveyed orally and in written form, thus preserved until now?
So the question is, like, the Quran has been preserved in its form, and they're like, no, what
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm suggesting here is that we should go back. We should go back to the origin, like before the interpretations, before the rules, before the, yeah. I mean, it's some people might think it's a little presumptuous. Who am I to undermine centuries of rules and regulations and so on? It's just my suggestion, it's sort of a modest suggestion, to go back and understand the text. I'm not going into the changing the legal system or anything like that, but I am a linguist. I'm not a legal scholar. I don't even consider myself like a Quran scholar. I am a linguist who's looking at the language of the Quran. So my approach is linguistic, and to understand the language and the text. And from that, you can build, all kinds of, you can build the understanding, you can build regulations, but in order to base anything, the starting point should be a good understanding of the text of the Quran from the linguistic perspective. And the Quranic language is strong, is clear, and coherent, and very well written. The language of the Quran is actually quite beautiful and clear when you approach it this way. And it's too bad that Muslims very often are not that interested in the real meaning. They're satisfied with a vague understanding. But if you really go back, read it correctly, I think you would find it a much more rewarding experience.
Right. Having discussed about the Quranic reading based on Rasm, I wonder, how does the idea of reading the Quran based on Rasm can signify in understanding the text in modern ways?
I'm sorry, what was the last word you said? Understanding the text in
modern context. I mean, like
In
for
modern-
the learners of the Quran nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the example of Al-Kafirun, many Muslims, unfortunately now, they sort of isolate themselves and say, we're Muslim, we're different, we don't integrate into other societies, we're different, we don't share things with you. You are kafirs, you are this, you're that. But when you look at it as we all are trying to reach God, we all I mean, no one understands how the rain is formed. No one knows why so many things, how a tree grows, what makes a tree grow, what makes how is a child made, how is all these things that human beings have wondered about. And science, I mean, look at how advanced we are. People have reached the moon, they've reached Mars, but some basic things about creation, about just very things that are close to us, we don't really understand them. And the Muslim has trouble understanding them, the Christian, the Jew, the atheist, everybody, we don't really understand them. So it's a call for, like a really modest call for, look around you and look at these wonders, and it's a call to belief. There must be a power, there must be a creator, there must be something behind all of this that regulates it. That, look at this system, look at the planets, look at the constant, look at all of this, how it's running so perfectly. The Christian, the Muslim, the Jew, the atheist, everybody wonders about that. How does it happen? Some people will say, there's a power, there's something. Some people will call it God, Allah, this. So I think people, should look at it that way. We have so much in common with others, and we all wondered about the same things, and we don't have the answers. And we are all in the same boat. We don't really know what's going on, and we wonder. And we, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Christian, the Jew, is trying their best to understand what's going on, what goes around them. And this sort of brings people together instead of conflict and fighting and, no, I am right, you're wrong. We want to say, we're all wondering. We don't really know. We try to understand. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, we get closer, we get farther, and to each his own. And you know, like a verse like Lakum dinukum waliya din. It's like, I mean, there's nothing can be more tolerant than this. You have your way, I have mine. We don't have to fight. You know, we can live together, you know, but you have your way, I have mine. No problem.
Yeah, it sounds like more humanistic to
Yeah.
the humanity and harmony between religions. And perhaps one more question, but it may quite random. If you are to estimate how many like erroneous verses in the Quran based on your observation through the Rasm.
How many errors?
Yeah.
I don't like to use the word error. I mean, this is it's not. I would say, you know, it's more like, I would say, like manipulations or changes by the interpreters, by human beings like us, people who wanted to please the king, who wanted to you know, you see nowadays, like the way people, you know,
Yes.
the people in the media, for example, they go to President Sisi and they want to please him, and they are willing to sell everything and just to please the king, please the ruler, please the president. So I think human beings are human beings, and they will fall in the same, you know, same pitfalls that people fall into. So I would avoid using the word error. I would say, you know, like certain changes that took place over time with the idea of introducing certain understandings of specific verses, with the goal, for example, with the goal of excluding, like being antagonistic to other religions. I mean, much of the material against Christians and Jews and non-Muslims probably was not found in the Quran itself. Some of it is there, but a lot of it is not. Like many of the hadiths attributed to the Prophet that are based on a certain verse probably were invented to criticize or to condemn the Jews or the Christians as a way of, you know, like consolidating the Muslim identity or something like this, which is like a, you know, a human thing, a politically motivated thing. So again, going back, I wouldn't say errors. I would go back to the Rasm. The Rasm is clear, well-founded, but it needs to be reread without any agenda, without a political agenda. Reread as a text, as a solid text, coherent with a message, and contextualize it, read it within the context of other languages and religions and so on.
Okay, I think we have reached to the end of the webinar series here. And before we close, perhaps I want to make some conclusion in Bahasa Indonesia, Prof.
Okay, please.
Ya, teman-teman semua, karena kita sudah mendengarkan bagaimana Prof. Munzir Yunis menjelaskan bagaimana ide beliau, konsep beliau tentang membaca Al-Quran kembali melalui Rasm, dan di akhir tadi beliau juga menegaskan bahwa kita perlu membaca kembali Al-Quran, menulis kembali bahkan berdasarkan Rasm ketika Al-Quran itu ditulis pertama tanpa ada kepentingan politik, tanpa ada kepentingan pribadi, dan lain sebagainya yang akan berpengaruh terhadap berubahnya kalimat-kalimat dalam Al-Quran. Beliau berpesan seperti itu, dan ini merupakan encouragement atau motivasi bagi kita semua untuk kembali menggali makna-makna Al-Quran dan menemukan bagaimana penafsiran Al-Quran berdasarkan bentuk Al-Quran pada masa ketika ditulis di awal. And that's all, I think. Prof, do you want to say perhaps a few sentences to us to conclude all your presentation today?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much again for having me here. One thing I'd like to say is that if there's anything I can do to help you, many of you probably are, beginning their careers or they want to do more studies of the Quran. I'll be very happy to answer your questions. If you would like to email me, my email, I'll just write my email here. If you would like to write it down, it's very easy.
Yeah, I believe many of us are really wondering a lot of things about your concept.
Yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And I am okay. Let me just write this here. So this is my email. Please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer questions. And I am very happy that that we can talk about this without people being offended. Very often, a lot of people really get offended the minute you start saying, there's possibly another way of looking at this. They don't want to hear that. They will cite a verse from the Quran saying, inna nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. And like the Quran is there, you cannot touch it. You can, but the goal really is very simple, to really understand it. We read it every day, and I feel sad that 2 billion people read the text every day, and they're not willing to, or they are not interested in really understanding what it means, in the real understanding. They are satisfied with sort of a vague understanding of the Quran. So the idea here is to really understand it, understand the original message, which is a humane message, a universal message, friendly message that, for coexistence and acceptance, belief, wondering about things around you, and all good things. And when you see the kind of violence that is perpetrated in the name of the Quran, and they cite the Quran very often, and or some hadith or something like this, that are carried out in the name of Islam and the Quran, you feel sad that these things happen, and that there's enough for people. There's enough to show tolerance and to really emphasize coexistence, acceptance of others, and so on. And the Quran is full of that, and that's what we should emphasize. Yeah. And thank you very much again. Thank you very much, and please feel free to write to me if you would like.
Okay, thank you very much for such an insightful discussion tonight, Prof. And I would like to hand over the time to the MC, Mas Roshad, please. Thank you very much, Prof. We will have photo session soon, so I hope you can stay here a little longer. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for Aska, and thank you for Professor Mundir Yunis for incredible explanation and insight. So, ladies and gentlemen, as our agenda ran well without any obstacles, before we close, we will hold the group photo sessions. So, may to all the viewers or participants here to open your camera because we want to take a photo with the Professor Mundir and all the participant here. Silakan bagi teman-teman untuk menyalakan kameranya karena kita akan sesi foto bersama. Oke, sesi foto akan berjalan selama 3 kali. So the session for photo is 3 slides here. I will count for the first slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the second slide. 1, 2, 3. And the last slide. 1, 2, 3. All right. Okay, thank you for the Professor Mundir Yunis for incredible speaker, our incredible speaker. And we hope you can join again in our next meeting, maybe.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And It extends to the best appreciation to all the participants, especially for the Professor Mundir and the institution and community of Islamic and Quranic studies for their valuable collaborations, such as Ibih Tafsir, and then the Pasca Sarjana or the postgraduate from the University of PTIK, and then the Santrimang Global Community, the studyislam.id, and then here the Ribat, Syajaratun Nusa, Sri Kandi Insight, and the BKUMI, the Ulama Association, and the Studi Tafsir, FKMTHI, HMPS, IAT, UIN Syarif Hidayatullah, C1 Squad, HMPS IAT UIN Maliki, HMPS IAT UIN Sunan Ampel, IAIN Ponorogo, Lingkaran Studi Al-Quran dan Tafsir Yogyakarta, AIAT, Asosiasi Ilmu Al-Quran dan Tafsir se-Indonesia. Thank you for all the participants and the collaboration for this webinar. And thank you for all. Now we step to the last agenda, that is closing, and will be closed by reciting Hamdalah together. 1, 2, 3. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam.
wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof.